So thank you for everyone for joining in to talk today about NNOCCI and the science of communicating climate change. This introduction to effective climate change communication has really been in the works for over a decade now, and we're excited to share with you kind of some of these elements, and we welcome your questions. We're in a webinar format, so we won't be able to see them all in real time, but please know that we'll check and we'll have time for those questions at the end. And we'll be able to add additional resources to your follow-up email to make sure that you have all the content that you need. So my name is Kayla McCurry. I'm the Conservation Outreach Manager for Polar Bears International. I've been an NNOCCI facilitator and framer since 2016. And I've been a part of the board of directors and governing council for the training committee and the curriculum as in the curriculum director role. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about this effective climate change communication strategy. And I'm joined by Kirsten, who I will let introduce herself, who's also chiming in from the same building with me.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for having me. So my name is Kirsten. I am a PhD student at the University of Manitoba studying polar bear mums and cubs. And it is such a great time of year to be here in Churchill, Manitoba, talking about this with all of you. I am also a NNOCCI framer myself and have been working with them from about a year now, which has been very exciting. And I do work alongside Kayla at Polar Bears International.
Yeah.
So we are excited to get started today, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Kirsten. Yes, so our hope today is to introduce you to a different approach for climate communication, one that's rooted in science and tested effective messaging. We'll really only begin to cover this approach, but we hope that it will inspire some new thoughts and techniques for you as you kind of go about these conversations around climate and provide guidance for ways that you can kind of engage with this NNOCCI network further. So we're going to talk about why we need to talk about climate change and maybe tell a different story, what NNOCCI strategic framing is, all of those elements of an impactful climate story, and how to stay connected to the network. As Kirsten mentioned, we're coming to you today from Churchill, Manitoba, the self-proclaimed polar bear capital of the world. Churchill is located on Treaty 5 territory, the traditional unceded and ancestral lands of the Swampy Cree, Saisi Dene, and Red River Métis, as well as the Inuit people. So the photo you see is the building that we're in now on the main Kelsey Ave in Churchill. So you might be thinking kind of like, why PBI? So as a science-based nonprofit focusing solely on polar bears and their sea ice habitat, we value research-based tools. And it's a really exciting time, right? At the confluence of social science and climate change communication, there's so much great research out there providing guidance and support for communicators. At PBI, we regularly use NNOCCI tested strategic framing concepts as an effective way of connecting the polar bear story with our audiences. And as Kirsten mentioned, it's an important time in the polar bear's life right now. It's denning season, and Kirsten is a polar bear researcher and NNOCCI framer who's getting ready to head out to the field to do her work with moms and cubs in just a couple of weeks. But it's here with me in PBI House, and so I was very excited when you said yes when I asked her if she would join me for today's broadcast to provide some real-world application examples to these framing concepts. So, real quick, let's have a pop quiz. Let's think, when we're thinking about climate change, what are the public perceptions? I'm sure all of us have a little bit of this in our mind all the time when we're starting to prepare to have these conversations. So, real quick pop quiz. What percentage of Americans think that climate change is happening now? If you already read Yale's research, you're going to have these numbers right off the top of your head. So go ahead and drop that in the chat. What are you thinking are the percentages of Americans that are thinking about climate change right now? All right, I'm seeing some, high numbers, like, 50, 75, some are lower, maybe only 25, 27. You're in the, okay, yeah. I love these. A lot of these are very, very close. Okay, so according to Yale's most recent data, 73% of Americans, according to the ongoing Climate Change in the American Mind study from Yale, think that climate change is happening right now, outnumbering those who think it is not happening by a ratio of more than 5 to 1, 70% to like 13%. Okay, question number 2. What percentage of Americans are worried about climate change? Drop your answers as well. Who is out there thinking about it, worried about it? Okay, another wide range. Yes, some up to 80, some down 40. I'm seeing a lot around 50%, 30. So I feel like some people are really aligned here. So 64% of Americans report that they're worried about climate change. This includes the 28% who say they're very worried. And 48% of Americans think that people in the United States are being harmed by global warming right now. 49% say that they have personally experienced the effects of global warming. All right, last pop quiz question. What percentage of Americans hear people talk about climate change in their daily life? Where do you think we're at? 10? Okay, these numbers, yeah, people are feeling like it's lower. Maybe some of us, I see some 80 and 90 numbers. Maybe those are those of us who are engaging in climate conversations and climate communications in our job. Yeah. Great. So the percentage of Americans that hear people talk about climate change is reported at 20%. And almost so in even more people, 62% of Americans say they rarely or never discuss this issue with families and friends, even though they think it's real and they're worried about it. Only 23% of people say they hear folks they know talking about climate change at least once a month. Only 20% of Americans say they hear people that they know talk about global warming once a month or more often, including 28% who say they never ever hear anybody talk about it. So what does this all mean? We know that Americans believe that climate change is happening now. They're worried about it, but they rarely talk about it. But they don't think it's too late to act. So we're going to dive a little bit more into this, like why do we have this spiral, the circle of silence, the spiral of silence, where people are concerned, but they might think that they have the minority opinion, so they're not speaking up.
Okay, and so now, because we're in beautiful Churchill, Manitoba in Canada, we thought that we would also run this pop quiz again, but for our Canadian audiences to see what perception is like in Canada. And so once again, if you can post your answers in the chat, what percentage of Canadians accept climate change exists? What do we think? 80%? Yeah, high. Yeah, higher. 85, 90%. Okay, so all pretty high. Okay, so the actual answer here is that the vast majority of Canadians, about 85%, are accepting that climate change is happening. And of those, we see that about 12% outside of that group express soft denial for climate change, with only 2 to 3% who do not believe that climate change exists. And now, how about the percentage of Canadians that would be worried about climate change? And you can post your answers in the chat. 100%. I like it. 70%. Yeah, some in the 80s. Totally. So on average, pretty high. So our real answer here is 72% of Canadians report being very worried or worried about the impacts of climate change. Only about 7% of Canadians are not worried at all. But there are large regional variations that do exist, with many people living in Quebec being the most worried and people from Alberta being the least. And now, final question. How many Canadians regularly talk about climate change? Yeah, I see the numbers are a lot lower in comparison. Yeah, 35. With my daughter, 85%. Absolutely. Great. Okay. So honestly, not enough. And so while most Canadians acknowledge that climate change does exist, most people are just not routinely talking about it. And so based on this research, we see that most Canadians believe that climate change is occurring, and most feel some degree of worry over the impacts. But despite all of this, we know that people are just not routinely talking about climate change. And although there are large geographic disparities in the sentiments that we see about climate change, um, it changes between where you are. And so this is where we have an enormous opportunity to encourage more and more people to be talking about climate change. And so public discourse is critical. To address climate change, we need people to be engaged at the individual level, at the community level, and we need our leaders to be engaged as well. And so for people that are working in informal science, for example, zoos, aquaria, you see a lot of people. We have lots of people coming through our doors each and every day, and they're ready to often hear these messages about climate change. For other people working in science or in scientific journalism as well, this is also a great opportunity to have more and more conversations about climate change and share this type of information. And so we are all such an integral component of these conversations, and we are an integral component of our communities. And so it's very important that when people look to us for this information, that we can share these framed climate messages very clearly. And talking about climate change and rethinking how we have those conversations and framing our messages can have such a huge impact. The more we can normalize these conversations and use this impactful language across our audiences, the more we can build support and encourage action. And so by working together, we can hopefully influence these larger networks through this type of communication and start all using this same kind of language.
At NNOCCI, we believe that together we can train enough voices and proven communication techniques to shift this national conversation about climate change to be more positive, civic-minded, and solutions-focused. And together our impact is amplified, right? Kirsten's talking about shared language. For a couple of examples we see a lot of climate communicators from informal science centers or from zoos and aquariums. And AZA, for example, those institutions see 183 million visitors a year in the US alone, more than 200 million worldwide. That's more than the attendance of all of the US's 5 professional men's sports teams. The National Park Service recorded 312 million recreation visits to its sites in 2022. And each of us is part of these powerful networks, and the more we can normalize the conversation and use impactful language across our audiences, the more we can build support and action. And a big part of this strategic framing includes hope as a meaningful element of the conversation. Hopeful individuals are more likely to discuss climate change with their friends and family. They're going to support regulating CO2, and they'll act. So we know that discussing climate change leads to greater acceptance of climate science. So if we can increase the number of these conversations, we can really start to move the needle. So what is NNOCCI? We've got a problem. People not talking about climate change, and we've got an opportunity, this massive reach and the public trust with the primed audience who's ready to have the conversation. So NNOCCI started as an NSF funded project to bring together science educators, climate scientists, and social scientists to create a training program for interpreters based on strategic framing and an empirical approach to science translation to aid having conversations about climate change. It was launched in 2011, and NNOCCI has really been refined and continually developed as our network has grown. Evaluation shows that interpreters' confidence in their ability to explain and confidence in visitor interest has grown, and their concerns over visitor pushback have diminished as a result of utilizing these approaches and increased their willingness to discuss climate concepts in different settings. NNOCCI language increased visitors' understanding of climate change, support for solutions, and commitment to civic engagement. So this innovative, collaborative, and empirical inquiry has let NNOCCI launch a growing network of climate interpreters with tools that help millions of people to better understand why climate is changing and motivating them how to take action. And we have NNOCCI is a suite of programs that offers climate communicators opportunities to train and dig in more and work together in this community of practice. With over 800 trained framers and coaches across the world. So what's our goal? Our goal is to reframe this conversation. When you frame something as a communicator, what you do is emphasize parts of a complex issue, calling attention to certain things, values, symbols, metaphors, stories, more so than others. In this process, what you do is you're communicating why an issue may or may not be a problem, who or what is responsible for that problem and what we should do about it. One of the most common misunderstandings about framing is that there can actually be an unframed information. Every active communication, whether it's intentional or not, involves some type of framing and choice. So strategic communication frames, the goal with this approach is to help us become more strategic in the choices that we make, what we say, how we say it, and what we leave unsaid. It includes recommendations on communication elements that, when we use them together, will allow us to kind of navigate our way to the biggest impact. And we're looking to increase both the quality and the quantity of these climate conversations. So the two main parts of the strategy are understanding the prior ideas that people bring with them that affect the way that they take in information, and then relying on that data to select research-tested reframing elements that have been shown to move audience toward collective solutions, which is our goal. Now, it sounds like a lot, right? Like, where do we start? Communicators often fall into the same trap sometimes, right? We forget that a lot of how a message is received depends on what's already in someone's head, what their own lived experiences, and that has implications for our work, right? Knowing how someone might process the information they receive can help us craft the story to be most effective. Particularly at a time like we're in now, when there's an increased focus on social and racial justice, it's important to take time to navigate the landscape with our climate conversations carefully, so our approach is thoughtful and impactful. So we're going to start a little bit by talking how we process information. Kirsten is going to lead us on a short example.
All right, thanks, Kayla. So as Kayla so eloquently mentioned, we have to first understand what's going on in people's heads and how those prior ideas that they bring with them can impact how they come into one of these conversations if we want to create a story that is going to be impactful and relevant. So as an example, here on your screen, you can see the first page of images that come up when you do a Google image search for the word nature. And we're going to do a very short activity here. I want you to take a moment to look at these images. And in the chat, I want you to tell me what you notice. What do they have in common, for example? You can go ahead and do that now. Let's see what we get. Green, absolutely. Trees, life, greenery, running water, light. Yeah, all bright, very colorful. Pristine, not many people, absolutely. Ocean bias, lots of ocean. Good, good, very good. Yeah, so there's a lot of greenery, there's a lot of picturesque that we see. And you may notice that of these images, the vast majority of them show a very wide view of a landscape and depict only natural features in plant life, for example. If an animal is present, it does tend to be a charismatic megafauna, so something that is very large, recognizable. And there's often either no person involved, or that person is in a very Instagrammable pose, if you will. And it's no accident that these images are so similar. These images tend to make nature other and separates us from nature. And so this activity tells us something about how our culture thinks about nature. It's an example of what anthropologists will call a cultural mindset. And these are important because, as we've mentioned, we need to take into account the information that people bring with them into our communications. And cultural mindsets have implications for how we plan the content of our communications about climate change. So in this case, knowing about the default ways that people think about nature can make a big difference in how we would speak to someone about these images. And so looking critically, we can see that we have some work to do in getting people to think about ecosystems as a whole and our part in them. The communications research that's conducted on behalf of NNOCCI, for example, uncovered the deeply held cultural mindsets that people share not just about nature, but other topics, including climate change, for example. And so if we take a look at this image here, cultural mindsets are built over time through repeated interactions with people, institutions, and media. And yes, this image is just a field with a path running through it, but I promise it will make sense in just a moment. If you imagine a tall field of grass, when you walk when you walk through it just one time, the grass should just pop right back up, stays the same as it was. But if you continue to walk in that same field in the same way again and again, we create a path. And the same thing is going to happen in our brains when we have repeated exposure to different ideas. So as we experience new things in life, our synapses fire, and that makes connections between our neurons in our brain, and that forms a path. And so with more exposure, that path becomes more established. And that's how learning happens. And that's also how culture is learned. And so cognitive scientists have a term for the places in our brains where all of these paths come together, and those are called schemas. And cultural mindsets are schemas that are passed on from one person to another until most or even all people within a group become familiar with them. They can be created and reinforced as we interact and share with other peoples the same experiences that we have, including things like in our literature, through formal education, for example, even TV shows, movies, and games. And because cultures learned, these cultural mindsets can vary by geography, by religious belief, even from generation to generation. And so it's important to note that new experiences tend to be interpreted through old schemas. We all have these different lenses, for example, because once an established path is there, you're likely to go down it again rather than walking off the path. And so knowing that we have this default thinking about nature, what about for climate change and carbon dioxide, for example? So I want you to take a minute now to think about some of the common misconceptions that you might hear about climate change. They don't necessarily have to be misconceptions, but the things that you're hearing the most often about climate change, things that come up in your conversations, things you may hear in the media, and I want you to share them with us in the chat. Hopeless. Yeah. Climate change is just natural. Absolutely. It's just going to happen anyway. I am just one person. What can I do about it? Not a big deal. Not my problem. It's multifaceted, powerless, concerned, and overwhelmed. Oh, I like that one. They don't call it global warming anymore. Aren't they hiding it by calling it climate change? Yeah, next generation will fix it. Somebody else's problem. Absolutely. These are all, I've heard many of these myself. And so a lot of these things are going to spring to mind because we hear them a lot. And we may often even anticipate them if we're not hearing them. And many of them probably feel incredibly familiar to you and even expected, even if you haven't heard them recently, which is why they probably jump to mind so quickly. And so we know a couple of things just don't match up here. People in the US, people in Canada, we do care about climate change and its impact on the planet. We saw that in the little questionnaires, pop quiz that we did earlier on. But if we don't know how climate change works, then how can we know what to do about it? And so the bottom line is that if we don't know what carbon dioxide gas is, or how it plays a role in climate change and ocean change, then people can't produce these new innovative ideas to help address the problem. And so there are many cultural mindsets that the organization Frameworks Institute, which we will talk about in a more detail later, have identified, which we are going to take a closer look at. But first, Kayla is going to take a moment to show you some of the research that Frameworks has conducted so far to date, just so you can get a better idea.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation, Kirsten. I do think that sometimes it can be hard for us to anticipate what is going on in someone else's mind. So having some external tools to help guide that can be really helpful. We're going to show a little video that is some of the foundational research that Frameworks did to kind of get a sense of what these schemas are as they relate to climate change. And that kind of reinforces these misconceptions.
As part of a larger, more comprehensive investigation to find out how the public thinks about carbon dioxide and its role in climate change, Frameworks researchers conducted rapid interviews with ordinary Americans in locations across the country. So let's take a look at what this looks like in some excerpts from our on-the-street interviews, a rapid response research technique that Frameworks uses to confirm and visualize the findings of more in-depth research on public thinking.
What role do you think that carbon dioxide or CO2, what role does that play in the climate?
Very bad one.
Gosh, this is awful. I should know all this stuff.
Give me a definition if you don't mind.
That's what you exhale, right? Trees absorb it.
Think of trees, like processing carbon dioxide usually.
Isn't that like the car exhaust?
The fumes out of a car.
Car exhaust.
If you leave a car on in a garage, the carbon dioxide will go inside that car.
I don't know. I think trees absorb it, we exhale it. It's not good for us to inhale, but it's good for plant life.
So what do you think happens if there's too much carbon dioxide on the planet?
That means everybody's gonna die. We gonna all suffocate.
The impact, if there was a massively, like too much, it could impact our health in general. I don't know if too much of it could also negatively impact plant life.
I don't know, probably like greenhouse gases or something like that.
Something about the ozone, I think.
Oh, it affects the ozone layer greatly.
Everybody's saying the greenhouse effect, global warming. It like puts a hole in the ozone.
It's breaking down the ozone. I think it's the one that's doing that. I'm not sure.
I think it disrupts the ozone layer.
People were unable to easily reconcile carbon dioxide's role in respiration and photosynthesis with its role in climate change. To explain the harmful role of anthropogenic CO2, Frameworks developed and tested the taxonomy of regular versus rampant carbon dioxide. This helps distinguish between the CO2 that is necessary and CO2 buildup that is problematic. Researchers read this passage aloud and then asked participants follow-up questions about carbon dioxide, as well as some of the broader causes and consequences of climate change. Let's listen to how this way of framing information about the effects of CO2 worked to help participants distinguish between beneficial and harmful levels of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, from what I'm getting, regular is just the standard. If there was nothing, if there was no influx of carbon dioxide, regular is just the equilibrium. It's I breathe out, plant breathes in on a cycle. And then the rampant is if, two people breathe out and there's only one plant, the plant only needs the one breath, in a very, very simple analogy.
We're producing more carbon dioxide than a normal life cycle or environment would naturally, just as humans produce it and the environment consumes it, plants consume it, and it's just building up.
Carbon dioxide's a part of life. We need some of it, but we currently have way too much in the environment.
We have to find a way of lessening this rampant carbon dioxide that we're putting out.
Oh, you want to get rid of the rampant if you can, as much as possible.
More carpooling, more buses, more public transit, more bikes, just things that we can control in our everyday lives, things that are very simple that we just don't do.
So I'm going to stop the video there. I think it is really telling, right? We're able to not only see how many cognitive holes and gaps there were kind of in their understanding of really what climate change is or how it works, but also with a little bit of explanation, how they were, talking more confidently, they were able to speak to it. And even the last gentleman who was interviewed started offering solutions right away. He's like, oh, I have a better understanding of the problem, and immediately started just jumping in and offering solutions. So I think that is really powerful and kind of illustrates how the value of explanation. So Kirsten is again going to kind of jump in and talk to us a little bit about how we navigate these and how they can help inform our climate change communication.
Thank you, Kayla. So in partnership with Frameworks, NNOCCI has created this great tool that you see in front of you for helping you in conversations when it comes to these dominant patterns of public thinking. And so just quickly to go over this figure here, how do we interpret this map? So each of the individual cultural mindsets on this graphic are color-coded to remind you of which ones to tap into, because they will help you more productively frame your interpretation around climate change. And so in green, or denoted with a check mark, you can see that these are great. These help the public to understand the cause, mechanisms, and the implications of the issue. As we move into the yellow, or the ones denoted with a dot, we tend to think of these as cautionary. We want to proceed with caution when we're using these to address these cultural mindsets. And then in red, or with the dash, we have our unproductive points here. The public remains stuck in this predetermined way of thinking about an issue, which is not what we want to see. And so in this map, which we will be sending this along in a follow-up email after the webinar, this serves as a kind of roadmap to the way the public is thinking about issues surrounding climate change and the oceans. And they will hopefully help you to navigate how to best frame your messages about climate change and oceans as well when you take this information back with you to your home institutions. So you may have already noticed that these cultural mindsets are organized under these bigger sets of ideas. So the nature, science, health, for example. And we often will call these either buckets of thinking or cognitive domains. And so underneath each of these, we have examples that help you illustrate and summarize the main cultural mindsets that people will bring to bear on that domain. And I thought it'd be really great if Kayla could walk us through an example of that.
Yeah, so when we were kind of brainstorming earlier and you were dropping your ideas of like preconceived notions of climate change in the chat, I saw somebody added this like nature will fix itself, right? That nature works in cycles. This is short term. So that's kind of in this cognitive domain of nature. And you can see it's red, right? Like this is not an effective, it's an unproductive cultural mindset. So how can we navigate our conversations of we're encountering that to make it more productive? And often the easier thing to do is kind of steer that conversation away from this nature will fix itself to kind of this call to action of like something needs to be done about climate change, or nature is vital to humans. So really kind of bringing us back to that, including us in the story of climate change that we're telling, and kind of taking them from maybe a red, unproductive, and nudging through our interpretation towards a more green or productive cultural mindset. So yeah, this was all the foundation of this research and this work that we're doing with strategic framing was done in partnership with the Frameworks Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization that helps build these mission-driven framing formulas. And NNOCCI work with Frameworks to identify the cultural mindsets and develop and test communication strategies that we're going to outline right now. And I know this was like a lot of a preamble, and I'm sure many of you on the call are like, can you please just tell me how to talk about it? So we're going to dive into some of those examples next about like, okay, how can we put some of this theory that we've been talking about into practice? So when we're navigating conversations about climate change, how do we craft messages and engage in productive conversations that will navigate away from the unproductive cultural mindsets and inspire understanding and hope? To do that, we use some tested tools, and our methodology to have productive conversations around climate change can be kind of boiled down into these three questions: explaining why does it matter, how does it work, and what can we do about it? What we need to do is to change the story. It's not climate change is real and we're all going to die. It's helping the public fill in those missing cognitive holes. Like, is it the ozone layer? Is it pollution? Is it, I don't really know. So that we can all get on the same page and work together to improve the situation. So the first question is, why does it matter to society? There are a million reasons why climate change matters, but not all will move the public to act. And in fact, some will turn them off, those red unproductive mindsets. It's important to frame climate change as an issue that aligns with something that people already care about. So climate change doesn't compete for time and attention with other issues in their lives. But we can't assume that everyone cares about climate change or the ocean the same way we do. So Frameworks' research found that there are two values frames that are the strongest, most reliable ways to make a case for meaningful change in line with scientific consensus. And if we can all work to emphasize these, our impact will be amplified because we know that repetition is powerful. frameworks tested many values, and of all of those, the two that they found to be most effective are the ones that we're going to highlight today, and those are protection and responsible management. So protection is the value that tested the best at getting most people oriented and supportive of climate action. This value emphasizes the need to shield people from harm, stepping in to ensure people's safety. It also underlines the importance of risk reduction, concern for the welfare of others, and preserving habitats. The second value, the responsible management value, stresses the importance of using common sense and step-by-step approaches to come up with with responsible long-term plans that act in the best interest of future generations. Now, there's no rule of thumb for which value you use in climate communications. Both are effective. You can use both, but you kind of want to make sure you're clearly conveying whatever idea you're sharing and not kind of blending them halfway. Some values work better for some topics, or some people are more comfortable with one or the other. We recommend trying out both a bunch of times to see which one you're most comfortable with. With practice, it'll become much more natural to include these types of value statements in your communication. And Kirsten, who is, again, a polar bear researcher on the field, so she's going to show us some real life examples of using these values with examples from her work.
Okay. And so, as we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, we are here in beautiful Churchill, Manitoba. And so we thought, let's use these polar bear examples to help illustrate these concepts, hopefully a little bit more clearly. And so this time of year is so very important for our polar bear moms and cubs, as it's the time of year when they are preparing to emerge from the den with their new cubs before making their way out onto the sea ice where they can eat again for the first time in a long time. And so we're going to start here with an example using this value of protection. And so notice that the language that we used here is almost verbatim from some of the reframe cards, some of the things that you have seen on the previous slide. So what Kayla was talking about there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We know this language resonates well with people. And so we encourage you to use these terms, use the words that we're using here, because they have been proven to be so effective. And we know that specific communities may identify or not identify with these nuanced values on account of different cultural differences, for example. But as a note, be aware of who your audience is, most importantly, because while these values are tested, they are still quite broad. So it's important to make sure that you are thinking back to those cultural mindsets and that you do remember who your audience is. So just to read it out loud here, like you, I believe in protecting people, wildlife, and wild places from harm. So you can see that protection value right there, right at the beginning. Including polar bears and the sea ice habitat they call home. We are all interdependent and we need to take steps to safeguard our shared global ecosystem from the effects of climate change. And so now we're going to go back and we are going to try this again, but with the responsible management value. So again, very similar. A lot of the language that we use here, feel free to copy and paste. It's important that we use this same language we talked about, speaking the same language about climate change. This is exactly what we're talking about here. And so in this example here, all moms work hard, but polar bear moms are undoubtedly some of the hardest working moms out there. Climate change is their biggest threat, so taking practical, common sense steps to solve problems facing our environment today is in the best interest of future generations of people and polar bears. So again, here you can see where we've bolded that we've demonstrated this example of responsible management, managing these populations of bears as well as responsible management for ourselves as well. So back to you, Kayla.
Those are great examples, and I'm very biased, but I love the polar bear examples. And it's timely because International Polar Bear Day, which is celebrating moms and cubs, is coming up next week. February 27th is International Polar Bear Day, and so early happy International Polar Bear Day to all who celebrate. So we tackled that first part of our story, answering the question for our audiences, why does it matter? Next, we're going to focus on this middle part of our story. How does it work? We know that if someone understands how something works, they're more likely to act. So making sure that someone understands the mechanisms that work is really important. For that, we use the next strategic framing tool, explanatory metaphors and chains. You might recall the guessing machines we talked about at the beginning when there was a video and they're filling in the holes, right? They're talking about the ozone. They're talking about kind of getting what they struggled to identify the mechanisms of climate change. They would fill in these cognitive holes with other environmental terms that they remembered that weren't necessarily relevant to climate change. We want to return to these cognitive holes for a minute and discuss how we can stop people from filling them in on their own. We can combat these guessing machines by explaining how it works in a step-by-step manner, connecting the dots for people who we're talking to. So when we're talking about actions to address climate change, we're choosing actions that actually address the real cause. Knowing and understanding how something works is empowering and people can talk more confidently. You probably saw those people, they're standing up straighter, they're looking more directly at the camera, and they're sharing what they know. Without an explanation, people might come the wrong solutions. They might get not go the direction that we're hoping to. So people are more likely to act when they know how something works, and we weren't hoping to instill that confidence in our audiences. Good explanations help people understand the mechanisms that work. If they don't understand the problem, they might struggle to identify the right solution. If you don't connect the dots, they might become unsure and they might fill in that cognitive hole with an unproductive mindset or misleading information based on some other ingrained cultural mindset. By using an explanatory chain, you don't assume what people already know. Remember, research shows that people are more likely to act in a way that addresses the root cause if they understand the cause of the problem. So when we link the causes and impacts of an issue, it motivates people to think productively on multiple solutions and gives them a role in that story. So there are 4 metaphors that frameworks tested in our How Does It Work toolbox. And as we mentioned before, they've all been tested on over like 5,000 adults across North America and the US and Canada. And these tested metaphors are making the science sticky. That is, making it easier for people to remember how it works. It also helps to bypass some of those less productive cultural mindsets. So the basics of each metaphor, we have a heat trapping blanket that talks about the mechanisms of climate change and their source and the role of CO2, regular versus rampant, which was highlighted in the video, highlighting the differences between anthropogenic CO2 and naturally occurring CO2. A climate hearts metaphor, which is talking about the role of the ocean in regulating the Earth's climate system, and osteoporosis of the sea, how carbon dioxide changes the ocean's chemistry through ocean acidification. So we're going to focus on just one today, the heat trapping blanket. So this CO2 focused metaphor breaks down the basic mechanisms behind human-caused climate change. So what's the story that we're telling? When we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and methane gas for energy, we're adding more and more carbon dioxide gas into the atmosphere. This buildup acts like a blanket that traps heat around the world, which disrupts the climate. This metaphor makes some choices about what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize. It focuses on carbon dioxide buildup as the most significant factor contributing to temperature rise, and on the use of fossil fuels as what's adding CO2 to the atmosphere. By starting with the premise that the atmosphere is a blanket, it becomes thicker when CO2 is added to it. The metaphor really quickly establishes that a hole in the ozone is not the problem. In fact, it's the opposite. By introducing the idea that burning fossil fuels thickens this blanket, the model makes humans accountable for our actions, and it pulls forward the idea that we have a shared fate with nature. Explaining how carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels thickens this blanket, trapping in heat, contradicts the idea that change is natural or works in cycles. This metaphor, we can create an explanatory chain that connects the dots from the problem to the impact. And remember, this language has been tested with audiences for effectiveness. So when you're writing your own climate stories or talking to the public, it's not only okay, it's encouraged to use it verbatim. No need to reinvent the wheel. We all know that this language works. So you can take a screenshot or you can find this information in the following materials that we'll send. So once again, I'm going to ask Kirsten to kind of put this into context, like a real world example of how we might use a heat trapping blanket metaphor to tell the polar bear story.
Right. And like Kayla said, we are not reinventing the wheel here. You are going to see almost word for word exactly the explanatory chain that Kayla was just describing to you. And so we have taken the time here to pull together a climate story that uses the framework we've tested along with the metaphors and explanatory chains that we've discussed. And this story is specific to polar bear mums and cubs, of course, and the impact of climate change on their long-term survival. So polar bear mums need to bulk up on plenty of blubber-rich seals to retain enough energy to feed their cubs in the den. And one of the most important, which is one of the most important and vulnerable times for a female polar bear and her cubs. And the mother bear's rich milk is what's going to significantly contribute to the rapid growth of those cubs, but does come at a significant energetic cost to the mom. So now I'm going to read you the story that we have in front of you. Some of you may have already started reading. That is totally fine. So after feeding on the sea ice all winter, pregnant females in seasonal sea ice areas like Hudson Bay come ashore and make their way to their maternity dens. While fasting in the den, females will lose about 1 kilogram of body mass per day, which they can sustain if everything goes normally. The problem is that things are getting increasingly abnormal. Climate change is increasing their fasting period and forcing them to rely on their fat stores for longer periods. Western Hudson Bay polar bears are spending about a month longer on land than their grandparents did. This has been linked to the smaller body sizes, fewer cubs, and a declining population, a loss of about 50% from the 1980s to the 2010s. Longer fasts are especially hard on moms with nursing cubs. To save the sea ice that they depend on, we need to move away from burning fossil fuels for energy. The atmosphere is like a blanket that surrounds the Earth. When we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and methane gas for energy, we add more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this buildup is thickening this blanket, trapping in more heat around our Earth, which raises our average global temperature and disrupts the climate. This translates to later freezing and earlier breakup of sea ice, disrupting their ability to access prey. Reducing our emission of heat-trapping gases is the solution. So if we want to flip over to the next slide, we can kind of highlight some of those areas that we talked about. So you can see at the beginning, we're beginning to connect those dots. We're starting with the big cause, and we're looking at, okay, what's the problem? And that's everything that we can cover in that first little chunk of text. So we kind of start to make our way through and identify what that problem is. Then we're moving on to adding the metaphor. So that's where we added in the important points about the heat trapping blanket. So that is the metaphor that made the most sense for this climate story. But in your climate stories, that may be very different. The regular versus rampant might be more applicable to you, for example. And at the end, we kind of leave an impactful statement about what's at stake. And so that's kind of just a very quick way to, and just one example of many possible examples for how to use these metaphors and explanatory chains.
That's a great example. And now that we've sort of established tools for answering the questions, why does it matter and how does it work using values and explanatory metaphors and chains, it's time to connect people to how they can help improve the situation. And we do this by connecting them to collective, community-based solutions. If we have some of the values, if we've used some of the tools like values and metaphors well in our stories, we've primed our audience to act already. You know, just by, we saw in the example of them reading the regular versus rampant example, how he immediately was thinking about public transportation and lowering his CO2 emissions. We have to make sure we finish the story though and give them tangible and clear guidance on how to get started. Most people want to take action on climate, but they just might not be sure what to do. We have to guide them towards a solution that addresses the real problem, fossil fuels, at a scale that matches the severity of the problem. When used properly, the solutions part of our story can help redirect people away from the unproductive cultural models of individualism or big, scary, depressing, just clean it up, and politics as usual. Instead, we can cue up more productive cultural mindsets like we're problem solvers, we have a shared fate. When we include community level solutions in our story, we're telling people that concern for the climate is normal and action on climate is happening already all around us. We can come together as community members to address climate change and help change the decision-making context so that the sustainable choice is the easy choice for more people. You may have seen images early in the pandemic of clear skies and empty streets and some folks waxing poetic about how they wished it was always that way or how it would be great to get back to normal. A collective solutions approach thinks more about how our normal could be different. with systems in place that support a community-wide reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. So research shows us that many well-intentioned conservation messages may inadvertently be backfiring. For example, if our messages and exhibits leave visitors thinking, it's so great what this organization is doing to care for those animals, or I'm so glad scientists are out there doing all of that great work, it may mean that they're not seeing themselves as empowered to act, or not seeing themselves as a part of the story, that somebody else is taking care of it, that they need to be a scientist or working in a nonprofit in order to do useful work related to conservation. To counter that, in our climate stories, we hope to do three things. We hope to foster engagement and hope, give specific examples of programs and policies, and make specific asks of our audiences. What do we want them to do to be a part of the solution when they get home? Our goal is to get people thinking like community members. So we try to focus on community level actions or opportunities for people to work together. And sometimes research does show that focusing too large, like federal or international levels, can be disengaging for some folks because they just seem too far removed from their everyday lives and sometimes politicized. So community, city, and province level examples are likely to be really great motivators. And they're we think of it in three different types of solutions. So energy shift, energy efficiency, and talk about it. Knowing we want to focus on climate actions that are existing, local, and collective is important, but we still need to be more specific for folks to help them understand what types of actions can be impactful. So important that the actions that are focusing on the cause of climate change, heat trapping gases, and then be specific and focus on how we can address carbon dioxide and move our energy off of dirty fossil fuels, become more efficient so we reduce demand, and break the spiral of silence around climate change and carbon dioxide. We want to focus on emissions, therefore programs and actions that reduce or eliminate our carbon dioxide emissions are key. That's where energy shift and energy efficiency come into it. But talking about it is just as important. Research tells us that the majority of people in the US and Canada are concerned about climate change, as we highlighted at the top, but they're self-silencing because they're convinced they have the minority opinion. They're also maybe nervous about talking about it because they're not confident that they can do it correctly. So if we can empower the majority of folks who are already concerned to start talking about with their friends and families in their everyday lives, we can really turn the tide on this misconception and start mobilizing for change. Furthermore, if we highlight collective, local, and existing action, it will help us navigate to really productive cultural mindset. So we're going to wrap up the story of climate change as it relates to polar bears with another example from Kirsten on solutions. What can we do about it?
Okay, so we'll jump right in here. And this is an example that we actually use quite commonly here at Polar Bears International specifically. So like you, we believe in protecting people, wildlife, and wild places from harm, including polar bears and the sea ice habitat they call home. Reducing our emission of heat-trapping gases is the solution. The good news is that we have the power to make a change. We need to talk about it, and the more we do, the more we normalize these conversations and can fight to ensure the sustainable choice is the easy choice for more people. If we all join together and keep talking about it, we can do the collective work of creating a better world for all of us, people and polar bear families alike. And so in our next slide here, we have, again, we've broken this down for you in a little bit more detail. So you can see that the story starts by reminding our audience of the shared values they have. It explains clearly how the solution helps them to reduce CO2 and the co-benefits of the solutions to their communities. It's kind of the path that we want to take through the solution. And here, more specifically, we want to start by reminding people of the value. So we did that. We put that right at the beginning and used a specific example. And here in our example, the biggest thing that we can do for polar bears is talking about it. And so many of the guests that come through our facility here in Churchill are encouraged to talk about it with their friends and their family. And that's exactly what we're talking about here in this solution. We explain how they can help reduce CO2 and the co-benefits. So benefits for ourselves as well as our polar bear moms and cubs. And so here, it's important to remember that we need to avoid polarizing the situation. Climate change and talking about climate change can be tricky business, especially in certain climates here. And so Frameworks Institute has conducted a study of 4,500 individuals looking at how framing solutions can help you avoid these unproductive cultural mindsets. In today's hyper-polarized society, some phrases are just more effective than others. Doing some research back in 2016 and 2017 discovered that sometimes talking about community-level solutions can be polarizing. But fortunately, there are certain language tweaks that we can make that can help you steer clear of those unproductive areas. So as an example, instead of using the word politician, try using the word civic or community leaders. Instead of laws, you may want to use the term approaches. We are able to get the core concept across without some of the words themselves being distracting or even cueing some people to less helpful ideas or thoughts. And so by changing our language to stay neutral, this is going to keep us from polarizing the conversation, which is ultimately going to help people stay engaged with the material and view this as a community level issue, and hopefully how to understand how the climate is changing and what the effects would be to them and how these community level solutions could help them tackle the problem.
So there are 8 icons on this slide, which kind of represent the 3 categories that we've been talking about, kind of a visualization of these strategic framing tools. Everyone who registered for today's webinar will receive links to the videos and documents and papers and blogs provided. I saw Sue's question about climate action organization in different regions, and we can add some of those resources to that follow-up email as well. Included is also a template of how to create your own climate story using these components that we kind of identified, and we hope you'll explore it and use the resources to create your own climate story to share with your communities. I know we're up on time, so we're going to skip our next video and kind of just do a quick wrap up. Because there are more opportunities to connect. You can find us on social media, and NNOCCI is also offering a little bit of a deeper dive, like a 7-week course on how to build and practice these skills, where they're really diving more into each of these elements, and you're working with, a community of practice of like-minded communicators to really build those framing skills. Because we know as a result of increased feelings of self-efficacy and hope, along with the benefits of social support, these using strategic framing strategies become more likely to talk about it and more hopeful. So it's an opportunity for you. If you're interested, there's a QR code, and Kirsten did put that in the chat. But also, you're welcome to just check out our website, make an account for yourself, and we're all there together to, bounce ideas off of each other and support each other as we're navigating these conversations. We would also love if, help us stay scientific, right? We love feedback is our love language. So if you had an opportunity to take a 5-minute evaluation, give us some feedback, we would welcome that. We'll also be on. If you have questions, you feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll definitely review those questions to make sure that we have them in the follow-up materials that we're sharing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope it was a little bit helpful, and we do hope to see you in our NNOCCI network in the future. I'm going to play a quick 2-minute video on our way out, just to kind of highlight the polar bear story as it relates to climate change in a way we use it here at
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. A polar bear's life cycle is almost exclusively tied to the sea ice. Because polar bears rely on sea ice to hunt, to breed, and sometimes to den, sea ice loss from climate change is their biggest threat, and the reason the bears are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. What we learn about climate change impacts on polar bears in Hudson Bay can be applied across the Arctic to help conserve other populations. Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat disrupting the climate and melting Arctic sea ice. When Arctic waters are cold enough, the top layer freezes into a special type of ice called sea ice. Sea ice is to the ocean what soil is to a forest. It supports the entire Arctic food chain. Food from this marine ecosystem also sustains northern communities. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should, and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic, is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. Please stay in contact, and we hope you all join us also for International Polar Bear Day next week on February 27th.